Hello and welcome to another episode of the Meaning in the Middle podcast. Hello, Ryan.
Hello, Landon.
How you doing, bud?
Good to see you. I'm doing well, and yourself?
Doing well. Who is this man bathed in light?
All right. Well, um, so one of my favorite things is kind of sticking to the church calendar and allowing, the overarching themes of the year to keep us grounded in the story of Jesus. And one of my favorite sacred practices is that my friend here, Doug, and our friend Chris get together in Sanford every year, and we eat a very large German meal. And then we go bar hopping and usually end up at the Tiki Bar, Suffering Bastard, and and have conversations that are not so different than the one that we're going to have tonight. So this is my friend Doug. We've known each other. Doug, I was thinking about it. I want to say we met in 2004. Does that sound right? So we're very close to 20 years.
Yeah, maybe 05, because I think I was out of high school by the time we met, but maybe if it was the tail end of 2004.
Yeah, it was 2004,
Yep.
2005, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
We met through mutual friends. We lost contact for a little bit, and then I ended up moving back here and reconnecting with a lot of people from my first stint in Florida. And just the past couple of years, like I said, like getting together once a year and eating German food and drinking sugary tiki drinks has been absolutely fantastic. So, Doug, you earlier sent us like your kind of official title. Tell us what you're doing right now, so people have a little bit of context, and then we'll talk about your story a bit.
Yeah. So I am a doctoral candidate in philosophy and religious studies. I'm doing a degree kind of with one foot in each. So I could teach another department, which is what I typically do. I don't have any full professorship anywhere. I just adjunct teach and lecture at currently at the University of South Florida, and occasionally at other colleges if I can get extra teaching jobs for some extra money. So I work kind of right at the borders of philosophy, religious studies, and theology. Like if you were to draw a Venn diagram right where those things overlap, I work kind of right there, but probably closest to the philosophy side.
Do you have a working definition for those three things? Because I think some people might not understand the difference between like religious studies and theology, for example.
Yeah. Well, there's kind of a large story around that, which is religious studies is largely, I guess, what you might call an invention of the modern academy. That tried to look at all these different things that they may call religions or religious phenomena, and try to parse it out using the tools of various different disciplines like philosophy or anthropology or psychology, or things like that, but in particular emphasizing the religious sort of content, religious experience, religious consciousness, religious language, those kinds of things. Whereas theology, now I have a very weird definition of theology that I won't sort of talk about, but I would say sort of within the academy and in general, theology is usually the study of the teachings and content of a particular revelation or religious tradition, usually from a kind of what you might call an insider's perspective, from people who practice said faith or religion.
I very much would like to hear your weird definition, please. You're not getting off that easy.
Yeah.
Don't tease us.
So, I mean, I think I'm on good grounds with this, but I generally am and this is something I think we might get into more, but take theology to be really just right what it says in the word, which is the uniting of theos and logos. And in that sense, Heidegger, Derrida, Nietzsche, a number of thinkers tended to say that, the whole sort of constitution of the West is based around theological claims, even if we wouldn't think of them as, say, doctrines of the atonement or something else. Just even if you think of something like, right, so Heidegger talks about the ontological or ontotheological constitution of metaphysics, because it's based on talking about invisible realities. So that's a kind of theological claim. Or you might talk about like the sciences and the way the kind of fundamental orientation and belief of the sciences is that the world is rational and well ordered. But what reason do we have to believe that other than a basic kind of theological presupposition that the world is rational and well ordered? And so I would say my general weird definition of theology is really anything where we're kind of reaching beyond what the immediate, empirical data and experiences allow us to discuss. And I might say more about that too, because I think theology gives us a lot of tools when you aren't doing the kind of, parsing doctrines of the atonement or that kind of thing. It gives you a lot of really interesting tools to talk about things like idolatry, right? Like, I think Nietzsche, perhaps maybe more than any other thinker in the West, was the great destroyer of idolatry. But most people probably wouldn't think of him as a theologian, right, by any stretch. But there's a very interesting way where all he's talking about are the gods, right? Both their death and the twilight of the idols and everything in between. So that's my kind of weird definition, if that makes sense.
I love that. That's great. And I can't wait to get into that for sure. One of the things that we found most helpful, and I think it's part of how we framed this podcast, was that rarely are these kinds of discussions just purely objective. Like, we always bring ourselves into them, and like we've arrived at this point because of the experiences that we've had. So why don't you kind of give us like a 30,000 foot view of your journey, which I know a bit about, kind of specifically through like your spiritual and religious journey, and how you went from this like punk rock kid that I knew going to Cornerstone, Florida almost 20 years ago to now, like where you're at, and especially like working towards your doctorate and these kinds of things.
Yeah. So yeah, the 30,000 foot view, I guess I would just start with, whether it sounds trite or anything else. But I had a largely non-religious upbringing. My parents had me, baptized as a baby into the Catholic Church. And I guess by the time I get to my end of my story, I suppose there was no way that went null and void. But didn't go to Mass again, until I was 7 or 8 years old for First Communion, and then didn't go to church again until I was about 12 or 13. And at that point, I went to an evangelical church camp with the Southern Baptist Church, and kind of fell in love with it and was brought into, the faith in that way, I guess you might say, as Protestants might think of it. Obviously, as a Catholic, I think my baptism was what brought me into the faith. But I should also say, just as a kind of precursor, I'm largely ambivalent about my experience in the evangelical church, because on the one side, those people loved me, and I was a weird kid who was very needy, and they invited me into their homes, and they bought me meals, and drove me places when I didn't always have a great home life. But on the other side, there were a lot of things about it that were manipulative and very bad theology that encouraged teenage kids. Basically, you put a WMD in the hands of children, an ideological WMD in the hands of children. And so I have mixed feelings looking back on a lot of that stuff because it affected a lot of getting into my 20s. But so yeah, it was a pretty, I call it evangelical now. I think back then I would have called it fundamentalist, and I think that's more how it would have self-identified. And to the extent that you can make a distinction between those two things, which I know there are distinctions,
but there's a lot of overlap too.
Yes. But I have an overarching weird kind of trajectory there, right? Got really committed and really passionate, alienated as many people as I got close to, and ended up kind of around the time I got into my last years of high school, getting a little jaded with the whole thing because I was getting into the punk rock and hardcore scene. Was meeting a lot of people who didn't believe like me, who didn't think like me, whom I greatly respected or loved, who the people at my church told me I shouldn't be around. That led me to kind of leave that behind, and I went searching. I guess you might call that, in today's parlance, deconstruction. I did a kind of Samurai Jack or Batman kind of thing where I tried all the various traditions. I went to a Methodist church for a while. I was Pentecostal for a bit, and did all these different things, and ended up in a kind of Reformed church. And during that same time, I was just reading a lot and got really interested in the world, and I did some traveling, and that led me to decide that I wanted to go to college because I had never planned on going to college, never thought I would, and started studying philosophy. My thinking at that point, I remember, was very much I wanted to do something like C.S. Lewis or maybe a not quite as widely known name outside the philosophy world, but someone like Alvin Plantinga, right? This kind of very apologetics-based stuff, and very quickly fell out of love with that stuff, and in a large sense really abandoned a lot of it, and felt betrayed by even some of it, because I felt a lot of it didn't hold up under philosophical scrutiny. And then I found kind of Heidegger, Kierkegaard, and the phenomenological continental tradition. I found this one thinker as I became really interested in the philosophy of love, named Jean-Luc Marion, a French philosopher and theologian. And he, at the time, was teaching at University of Chicago. So I applied to grad school at University of Chicago, and by some providential miracle got in, and went and studied under him and became good friends with him, and he mentored me. Marion's claim to fame was he was a teacher at the Sorbonne, and he studied with Derrida and Levinas, and so those were his teachers and colleagues. So to a certain extent, when I'm feeling particularly braggadocious, I like to tell people Derrida is my intellectual grandfather.
I would say that
you're like, you think you deconstructed? Let me tell you something.
But yeah, so through all that, we moved to Chicago, and I'd in this time gotten married, and many other things in life had happened. But I had gotten really interested in church history and tradition, and so at this point, I had largely moved entirely away from evangelical fundamentalism, and even sort of, I guess, what you might call like low church Protestantism altogether, towards I was only really seriously considering Anglicanism Lutheranism and Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. And for all kinds of reasons, there's literally 1,000 of them. There's no particular one. And again, this isn't an apologetics podcast, so I've been steering clear of any of those kinds of things anyway. I landed in the Catholic Church. And so everything came full circle. But, to say a little bit more about that, I think I think Landon put it really well in one of your previous episodes, where a lot of people who deconstruct, they end up deconstructing just the kind of small vision of Christianity that they were given, but then they never look beyond that. And sometimes we forget that a lot of what modern evangelicalism is an invention of the 18th and 19th century pietist movements in Northern Europe and the US. And so, when I looked beyond that, I just kind of kept following the thread back and through the history of the church and looked at 16th century controversies and other various moments, where there were debates about heresy and all these different things. And, it wasn't any kind of smooth transition. And as I'm sure you guys know, my church is far from perfect. There are many, many, many issues there, but my sort of personal experience and my studies both led me kind of back towards the Catholic Church and a more historically grounded tradition. And and there are all kinds of reasons for that. But like I said, I'm trying to give the 30,000 foot view. And so through grad school, I fell in love with academia, kind of figured out my passions, particularly fell in love with Kierkegaard and St. Augustine. And they're the people I would say I spend almost all my time reading. So hopefully that all sort of makes sense as a coherent narrative.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's Landon and I have talked about it a bit, that it's like, as much as some people walk away from the faith looking for better thinkers, other people find the thinkers already within kind of the Christian tradition and the Christian household. And it's been neat coming into season 2 and like kind of engaging or re-engaging with some of those people and seeing like, what is it that they have to say that might just give us other options today, or maybe just challenge some of our foundational assumptions. I'd be curious, like what, maybe we can start here and then maybe we can talk like more the history of philosophy. What is it about Augustine and Kierkegaard that attracted you, or that continues to?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think with Kierkegaard, and maybe this is going to sound a little narcissistic, but I think I don't in any way mean this to be a kind of that I'm anywhere near as smart or as creative or talented as Kierkegaard. But when I first read Kierkegaard, it felt like a kindred spirit, right? It felt like someone was writing the way I think. And similarly with Augustine, right? I love the way Augustine approaches problems and concerns, and both of them are just, mad and passionate about the love of God and the love of neighbor, and they let that drive everything about their thinking. And so much about, you can definitely blame this partially on the modern world, but even in the classical world, in the ancient world, so much about trying to solve kind of human problems always comes down to some kind of rational or speculative endeavor, tends to be the typical strategy. And I like how Augustine just has this great sense of how sin screws everything up. And so the only remedy to that is love. And similar with, Kierkegaard, that, the world is just really screwed up. And no matter how well we sort of organize our thinking and rationality and our speculation, we end up not being able to even make sense of ourselves under such systems. And so, Kierkegaard has this great line where he says the system is like a tower, right? This great skyscraper that the speculative thinker builds, but they themselves have to live in a shack next door because they can't include themselves in the system because they always have to stand outside of it. And so it's like, well, what the hell is the use of the system at that point?
Yeah.
And, because it can't make sense of your very existence, which is the one thing we're all trying to do. So I think they both have a streak of that kind of resistance in them. So,
does that tie in with your punk rock past?
Maybe. It's almost impossible to figure out was I drawn to the punk rock hardcore scene because of the same reasons I'm drawn to Kierkegaard and Augustine, or is it the other way around? Was I somehow formed by my rebellious teenage years that somehow made me in my adult years go around looking? And I suspect there's no definite answer to that one way or the other.
Yeah. Love that. So Landon, do you have anything that you want to, I was going to just jump into the kind of history question, but do you have anything?
I think, can you give people an idea of where Kierkegaard and Augustine sit relative to maybe some other kind of mainstream, like, we're kind of making this punk rock correlation, but how would you define their niche in the kind of overall philosophy landscape?
Well, Augustine is,
if they're even together at all.
Yeah, so Augustine is, in the 5th century, 4th and 5th century, right around the time of the fall of Rome. So he's very thoroughly ancient, classical in his worldview, his mindset. A lot of people think of him as the kind of first medieval. So he's what launches the medieval period in some ways. Obviously the fall of Rome is a big part of that too. So, but I guess it's hard to even classify him though, because in some ways he thinks he has all these wonderful one-liners that you would think came from a 20th or 21st century thinker, right? Like, so he has this, someone asked him what's the best way to interpret his works, and he says whatever gives birth to the most possible interpretations, right? And he's talking about reading the scriptures, and he said, even if I go and ask Moses right now, it wouldn't make the scriptures any clearer. And so he has this very kind of postmodern, post-structuralist sensibility about him that he understands because he was such a brilliant rhetorician. He just understands how complicated speech and language are. And I think that's one of the things that makes him stand kind of athwart the tradition. In many ways, he kind of upends different things about the classical Greek and Roman philosophers by bringing in concepts like sin. The way he thinks about temporality is really interesting, and all kinds of other stuff. And then as far as Kierkegaard is a 19th century thinker. He comes after Hegel in the kind of typical canon. And in a certain sense, he is the first kind of post-Enlightenment thinker, right? Hegel's kind of the crowning achievement of the Enlightenment. And Kierkegaard, along with a few precursors, are the first to really call that whole project into question. And so, he's largely considered the father of existentialism, although I have some issues with the way that's sometimes characterized. But, we can get into that at some other point if you'd like. is that what you were asking for, Landon?
Yeah, I think that's great. Do you want to maybe just briefly define existentialism?
Yeah. So
If anything in philosophy can be defined briefly.
yeah, I think existentialism is a 20th century movement, particularly led by French thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and a number of others, Simone de Beauvoir, Michel Fanon, trying to think of who else, Albert Camus. So they largely think that we are just kind of thrown into the world, and we have no purpose. There is no external meaning, and that we have no essential feature or function or nature. And so the only thing we can do is kind of force the world to make sense by our choices, by our absolute sort of free choices. And a lot of people, because of certain features of existentialism, will retroactively include people like, Heidegger, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard into the kind of existentialist canon. But I have my own reasons for that being a problem. One, because it's just kind of anachronistic, but two, I think it tends to shortchange the entirety of their works into being about one very small thing rather than being about the entirety of what their work is about. So
it feels like there's always kind of this like this like cycle in philosophy and religion to a certain degree, and I think we'll talk a little bit about those things, the kind of Cartesian move to split those things a little bit, because we've talked about it on the podcast already. But I'm very intrigued by what you're talking about there with St. Augustine and like his kind of recognition, like of all of when we try to like overly codify the system and get the perfect thing, that maybe that exists, but we can't possibly live into it. We've talked before about how like Plato, who was brilliant, and just we still don't fully understand everything that Plato has done to kind of shape our culture today, thousands of years on. But it felt like he maybe had more of that mindset of trying to figure out the perfect structure into which everything could fit, to the point where, like, one of my little things that I like about him is someone said, should there be disparity between pay for the employer and the employee? And he said, yes, it's okay if there's a disparity, and the ratio should be 3-1. And you're like, okay, but why 3-1? You know what I mean? Right. But it's like everything it's like if we can get everything in order, we've created the perfect society. And it seems like philosophy has always required these arsons that come along. Maybe it's even every few hundred years, and just kind of blow up that human tendency to need to overly structure things, because we start to believe the hype, and then it entraps us in a way. Does that resonate? Does that kind of feel like, because that's what I hear in you talking about, like the connections between like Augustine and Kierkegaard, is they're like these little arsonists that are like, let's just kind of blow up some of our assumptions of how this whole thing works.
Yeah. There's a thing that often happens in human thinking, and I think this isn't limited to philosophy, although, I guess I could say I've made, it my goal to specifically find these things in philosophy, where you get these kind of heuristic or pedagogical devices, right, that are meant to be explanatory in some way, right? So Cartesian dualism is a great one, right? Like, people will talk all about Cartesian dualism all day long, but when you actually read the Meditations, there's actually 3 substances, because Descartes is trying to model his substance ontology largely based around a Trinitarian view of the world, because Descartes was a pretty devout Catholic, right? But the reason people talk about Cartesian dualism is because usually in philosophy of mind, people talk about the distinction between the mind and the body. But then give teachers a couple hundred years of teaching that, nobody reads Descartes anymore, and therefore substance dualism or Cartesian dualism becomes the actual truth rather than the heuristic device. And I think you see this in all kinds of things, right? Like certain TV shows, right? They'll be really good, and then they'll figure out what it is that make themselves good, and they'll turn it into a formula, and it'll feel so forced and contrived, and you're like,
Yes,
you don't got it anymore. You can't do it.
You figured parody, kind of.
Yeah. And I think there's all kinds of examples of this throughout all kinds of human endeavors, but I tend to, pick up on the ones that are in philosophy and the history of philosophy. So I think that's a move that I'm always sort of looking for in different places where people, right, like the thing I just talked about in existentialism, where do people say this thing over and over again that actually doesn't really apply once we check out the phenomena itself? And I think you put that really good, Ryan, by talking about, the way arsonists come along and kind of blow that up and kind of break our ability to use those with any regularity. I think that's a really good way of putting it.
And for the right reasons too, right? Like it's what captures me about Augustine a lot is in his best moments, it's for the sake of love.
Yeah.
So he's like an arsonist of love. Or I liked, isn't it Levinas who kind of reversed like philosophia from the love of philosophy to the philosophy of love? Isn't that Levinas?
I mean, Levinas definitely talks a lot about, unconditional regard for the other and the alter the other, demanding something of us just by their sheer being other. I mean, there's a number of people who've talked about emphasizing the love aspect in Philosophia. But I'm not sure exactly who that is. That particular quote, I suppose, maybe from Levinas, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'll have to go back and look at that one. There's too many books on that shelf that I have not yet gotten to.
I think we're all probably the types. We have very long lists of books that we're...
Sorry, I'm no help there.
Yeah. So it feels like so thinking about that idea that, our philosophical or theological endeavors become overly codified, and then they no longer seem to serve us because or maybe another way of thinking of it is like it becomes like a Xerox. When you Xerox a Xerox over and over time, it just kind of loses its beauty or its efficacy. And it feels like we're kind of at one of those moments now in history where, we talked about it before in the podcast, and we talked about it with like Vervaeke and some other people, that the modernist project has failed us. But it also kind of feels like maybe the postmodernist project is failing us. I think what began as philosophical arson, in a probably a necessary way, or my interpretation anyway, would be postmodernism was philosophical arson to kind of clear the threshing floor from an overly codified modernism. But now that's kind of running out of steam. And I remember sitting in a course at Cambridge where he's talking about like, we live in a world where both of those things are true simultaneously. It's not like modernism ended and now we're in postmodernism. It's like they both are kind of uncomfortably living side by side.
Yeah, it's like layered on top.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe let's first talk about like looking back to maybe especially those two thinkers, what they might offer to the conversation today, and then we'll talk about what you think might be next. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that's really helpful. I'll probably also bring Nietzsche into this story, if that's okay.
He's welcome anytime. on our podcast.
Yeah. So
Nietzsche, if you're listening, you can come on anytime.
His mustache just twitched. So yeah, I think if you're to look at the kind of history of how we got here, I tend to buy into what is often called the SCOTUS or the Occam story, right? Which is, as I mentioned, my weird definition of theology back at the beginning. You could put this as stoic as it goes in theology, so it went with modernity. And so what you have is in the classical sort of post-Christian world up until Occam and Scotus, which is going to be, 12th century or so, a little later. You have this idea of God being defined by God's being. And God's being is defined by God's nature. And so who God is what God does. But with Scotus and Occam, you have this movement where God's will or God's freedom becomes, in some sense, more important than God's being. Now, Scotus and Occam readers might be turning over in their grave because I'm putting this stamp on them. But the idea here,
it also
is
sounds you're like you're talking about a cool indie band, Scotus and Occam.
Yeah. No. So Duns Scotus and William of Occam, right? Occam's razor. We get that from William of Occam. Mm-hmm. They are typically credited with this movement known as like nominalism, or God's will becoming more important than God's being. And you might say, well, why are you talking about all this? Well, what you get are these kind of ripple effects, because ideology has a tendency to move down the line very slow. And from there, if God's will is more important than God's being, then guaranteeing God's absolute freedom becomes important in defining God philosophically. So therefore you get what's often called the God of metaphysics, as Descartes defines God as a substance that is self-caused, self-created, omniscient, omnipotent, all these kinds of things. But you also get something like the first point in history where there's a real strong emphasis on absolute individualism, which will pave the way for someone like Luther. Now, people who buy into the Scotus or Occam story largely go from there to usually blaming everything on Scotus and Occam, even stuff like global warming and everything else. I don't buy into it that far, and I have my own issues with aspects of the story, but I think what you do get is, as the will becomes more important than nature, then so the will becomes the absolute value, and that's what paves the way for Protestantism, modern liberal democracies, the rise of the nation state, the invention of national identities, and so on and so forth. All these things you get in modernity, but also, right, the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, all these other kinds of things. So it gives rise to things like Adam Smith's thinking in terms in individual competition writ large, which is what largely defines, the founding of capitalism. And so you have all these like things, both good and bad, all mixed together, that come to life in this Scotus story. And I think in a certain sense, all the philosophy you see from Descartes to Hegel is riding that wave and trying to make sense of it. So why did Descartes have to make the subject the absolute foundation of all epistemology? Well, because there was no external kind of nature to ground it in. So he had to make subjectivity the foundation. And so very early on in the Meditations, Descartes explicitly rejects the kind of Aristotelian worldview, or the classical worldview. And so fast forward a few hundred years to the 19th century, where Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are, and you get the rise of what I largely call anti-metaphysical philosophy, which is trying to think solely in terms of mere experience, in terms of empiricism, and this move away from trying to think in terms of first principles, of absolute truths, ultimacy, all these kinds of things that a lot of people associate with postmodernity nowadays. I think it really starts in the 19th century. And you have different forms of this as take place on the continent, of Europe, which starts with Nietzsche and goes up through postmodernity. But on the other side, in the kind of English-speaking world, you have the rise of something known as logical positivism, which is a kind of, I think, something Landon has said a couple times on the podcast that I think is great. You have this kind of flattening of meaning, where positivism just says that only those things which can be proved empirically or in principle empirically are meaningful statements, and everything else is just meaningless or like poetry or something, right? So
it's the only kind of credibility that we have.
Yeah. So what you get is this kind of scientification of language on the one side of the world, which is kind of the English-speaking side, and then on the sort of continental side, you get this moving towards self-creation and immediate experiences because there's no overarching structure. And there are all kinds of interesting things that happen in that period. But one of the things about positivism that I think is interesting is, even though it was largely abandoned in academia, because what you have is this idea called verificationism, which is if only statements that are true, if only statements are true that can be verified empirically or in principle empirically, then, well, that's great because you get rid of things like arguing about whether or not God exists, because that's a meaningless statement under that system. But you also get rid of things like stealing is wrong or murder is wrong, or war crimes are bad. But even worse, someone, and I don't know how they didn't catch this, the very criterion by which you judge statements to be true or false or meaningless or meaningful itself is not empirically verifiable. So the whole system is self-refuting. It eats itself. And
right.
But
kind of like the principle, all truths are relative.
Yes.
And then you have to say,
right.
with the exception of this.
Yes. Yeah. It's another kind of self-refuting statement, right? And so what you get in that flattening of meaning, though, is the tales of positivism are still felt today, right? As someone who teaches philosophy, I can't tell you how many of my students come through my classes, and when I say something is true or false that isn't a scientific or mathematical statement, they're like, wait, that's anything that isn't science or math isn't true. It's just opinion, right? And so
where do you find that typically comes up? Is that typically like a moral statement?
Yeah, usually in ethics classes, but also if I'm teaching like intro to philosophy and I teach someone about like metaphysics, right? About like even just kind of logical truths, like the universe can't both exist or not exist at the same time. And they'll be like, well, that's just an opinion. It's like, why? But
prove it.
Yeah, right.
These dumb undergrads.
But and I think part of that is just in our DNA, right? It's in our ideological DNA. So this whole story, right? The Scotus story leading to anti-metaphysical philosophy, leading to positivism. I think largely that's what I think gives rise to a lot of the meaning crisis we experience. Now, I could talk for hours about any particular parts of any of that stuff. But on the other side of that, I guess I would say what we're kind of largely searching for, I think, is and why we've been suspicious of the Enlightenment, but also of postmodernity, I think, is we've been grasping for, something that is both going to sort of have cash value in our day-to-day lives, but also that is somehow grounded in something beyond our sort of basic petty desires, wants, concerns, etc., right? So we all seem to have both of those intuitions, but most of us, I think, me included, I think, don't often try to parse out exactly what it is that it would entail to move beyond that.
Yeah. Which is, it's one of the things that blows my mind studying philosophy or theology. One of my favorite things that you said to me once, I can't remember if it was at the German restaurant or at the tiki bar, was that your greatest
hope. Remember, it was probably the tiki bar.
Yes, exactly. One of your greatest hopes as an aspiring philosopher is that in 150 to 250 years, someone might read something that you wrote. But that seems to be, it's wild to see that the threads of things that we take for granted today, like they're the lenses on our faces. Like you don't ever pay attention to your glasses. You never question them because they're just always there. These are things that were laid down for us hundreds of years ago that kind of wheedled their way into just our kind of collective conscious, and we can't see them. We just take them like we hold all truths to be self-evident. Like this is just the way that it is. And I remember, we've talked a little bit about Stanley Hauerwas, whom I'm a big fan of, an ethicist, and he talks about the American Project of Freedom, for example, that you are a self-made man. And he says that we believe the story that we should have no story except for the story that we chose for ourselves, which in and of itself is a story that we were handed. Like the illusion that like someone told you can be whoever you want to be. And that is tainted. Now you think about that and you're like, oh, that's philosophically like that's uninteresting to me, or I don't really care to think through those things. But then you see how that plays out in our daily lives and the little narratives we continually tell ourselves, or those foundational assumptions that we have that guide a lot of our understanding of who we are or what's happening in the world around us. You see how vital.
Did Ryan freeze or did I?
Oh. Ryan froze for a moment.
Okay.
But okay. It shouldn't matter, right? Because it's recording in hi-fi.
Well, it'll matter because
right?
we notice, but yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Whatever. Here, watch this. Ready? That's the cut. But it seems so vital to me that we understand like the history of philosophy to recognize like, man, some of these things that have been in the water right now that we just take for granted were laid down so long ago, and they still have a hold on some of our basic assumptions about life, but the patterns out of which we live in a way that we don't even notice it.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, Doug, how would you, kind of like Ryan was kind of broadcasting there, like I'd like to take a look present and then potentially kind of looking forward a little bit. Like in other episodes, like you referenced, we've talked about this flattening of meaning, the sort of atomization of society, whether that's through philosophical movements as well as technological advancements like social media. These all kind of weave together and they're sort of nested inside of each other in a lot of ways. But from these philosophers that you focus on a lot and kind of your kind of position in philosophical world. What do you draw from these voices to speak to kind of where we're at right now? And I think do those, and maybe does some of that insight give us a little bit of a flashlight forward to kind of say, how do we address the meaning crisis?
Yeah.
That's a bit. How do we fix the meaning crisis, Doug?
How does Doug think Kierkegaard is going to fix the meaning crisis? That's the particular question.
This podcast could be the thing. The clip you're about to create could be the thing that's viewed in 200 years. So
yeah. It'll be in some like canonical for leaving its kind of situation.
How do we fix the world, Doug? Yeah.
People living in a bunker somewhere just find this clip of audio. Yeah.
And video. Don't forget.
So Ryan asked me a really great question, and I blathered on about the Skoda story forever without actually answering his question about how Kierkegaard and Nietzsche play into this, and Augustine. So I'm going to answer your question, Landon, by I think there's two ways in which Nietzsche and Kierkegaard help with this. One of them is I take my own model of thinking from something Nietzsche famously said, which is, I philosophize with a hammer. And most people think that's because Nietzsche comes through and he just destroys all of Western metaphysics, all concepts of truth, declares that all values are gone, right? Which is what he means when he says God is dead, right? Mm-hmm. He means that there's no metaphysics, there's no values. But when he's talking about this, he's actually specifically referring to something, right? It's something that he refers to throughout many of his works, and he talks about it in Twilight, the Idols, and all these different things. When he says, I philosophize with a hammer, it's a hammer where you tap the idols and you listen to hear whether they're hollow or not. And I think that's a lot of what I see. On the one hand, I think you guys are doing a really good job in this podcast, trying to look for the idols and kind of tap on them and see if they ring hollow. And I think that's what we're looking for when we're looking for meaning. Now, what I think a lot of people do is they do the kind of, take a Donkey Kong hammer and just smash through everything and try to kind of raise the earth. And then they're like, what happened? I think there's this
Let me just say, you get bonus points for talking about Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and then referencing a Donkey Kong hammer. The mashup that the internet has been waiting for. Yeah,
that's the album cover for Scotus and Occam's first album.
There you go. There it is.
But one of the things I think, and I'll say more about Nietzsche and then I'll circle back to Kierkegaard. One of the things I think that leads us to our current meaning crisis is I think we're one of the most historically conscious people in history, not in the sense of that we know history particularly well, but just that we're formed by history in a way that other people perhaps in previous eras weren't, precisely because there were large breaks in cultural contact, in all kinds of different things. And so I think one of the things you see is there isn't this ability to figure out which idols to let go of and which idols to hold on to. So when Nietzsche declares in the parable of the madman that God is dead, one of the things that he immediately does afterwards is he uses all this poetic language and he says, who unchained the earth from its sun? He's talking about Copernicus there. And he gives all these other examples where he's talking about kind of the great thinkers of the Enlightenment. And the final moment is they all laugh at him. in the marketplace. They're like, why are you looking for God? Of course God is dead. But part of what the kind of tension there in the parable of the madman is there's some people who are still holding on to the old idols of metaphysics and ultimate truth values and these kinds of things, but they want the God part gone too, and they want the values gone and all this other stuff, and so they want to kind of have their cake and eat it too. So I think part of what we as historically conscious people are working through is part of what Ryan said, how these things are layered on top of each other. Like, we're both modern and postmodern, but we also are weirdly right now in the kind of post-McIntyrean age. And, you know, you've mentioned Peterson a bunch of times on this podcast. People are reaching back to him because he's pointing back to kind of, you know, the Bible and the Homeric Greeks and all the, and people are kind of trying to have this ideological buffet, but I don't think anyone's really tapping the idols and trying to listen to see whether they're hollow or not.
Wow. And real quickly, in some of the interpretations of Nietzsche that I've read, his statement "God is dead" is as much a lament and a deep worry about what comes next. Right? It's not just, you're saying, like, the hammer is more for testing the idol than it is for destruction. Like, declaring God is dead is as much a warning to what might happen as it is a declaration of that, like, being that era being over, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly not a triumphant declaration, much as you might think, right, seeing it on every bathroom stall written by some, you know.
No, because it's God is dead and we have killed him, and who will wash away the blood, right? Is the whole.
Yeah, and part of the lament is he's really trying to push through, like, if God is dead, if values are dead, us living in this kind of post-Christian society, but with generally kind of Victorian values, is the most hypocritical thing we could do. Or, you know, if there is no actual structure or rational order to the universe, then us trying to impose structure on it with the sciences or whatever is no different than the religious person making up a myth about God, right? They're just two different kind of magicians working their magic. And what Nietzsche is doing in the lament about God being dead is that nobody wants to admit that all those things are on the same footing if and when God is dead, right? So, yeah, and then the lament is, how do we get past this? Because the final thing the madman says is, I've come too soon, because nobody's ready to listen to him, right? The people in the churches are pissed off at him. They're like, you're crazy. The people in the marketplace, they laugh at him. And everywhere he goes, and finally he just goes back and says, I came too soon, right?
Dang.
So that's the Nietzsche side of things. And then on the other side of it, so Kierkegaard, who I've actually talked about quite little, I think one of the things that's fascinating about Kierkegaard is his indirect communication, right? So he, most of his texts, including one you guys have talked about previously on the show, are written by pseudonyms. And the pseudonyms are meant to kind of force the reader to tease out meaning for themselves in the text, but not in the sense of anything goes, but it's more about, he likes to talk about setting up the conditions by which you could have a moment to embrace subjectivity or to become subjective oneself. And so I think there's a way in which Kierkegaard's trying to coax things out of people who aren't willing to sort of do that themselves, but also they're not doing it just based on, you know, one of the things I really hate in philosophy is a lot of my colleagues do what I call epistemic collecting. They're like, well, if you're a libertarian about free will and a dualist about minds and a non-realist about science and all this, as though our beliefs about the world are just things we collect, like Pokemon cards or something, right? Okay. I think Kierkegaard is trying to force us to not be able to do that by not pinning our sort of moving through the world, our existence, on any external structures, or nor on his own authority as an author. And I think at its best, that's all that Plato was doing too. And I think that's what Augustine is doing in the Confessions as well. And so why do I find that appealing? Well, if there's anything I've learned throughout my adult life, but particularly, let's say, in the last 10 years or so, I'm not super confident about, say, the public use of reason. I think there's something about approaching individuals on an individual level and teasing out conversations like this. I think that is much more effective.
I think you just hurt a lot of people's feelings.
That was just, I'm not confident in the public use of reason. That's a quote.
That's the subtitle.
I'm sorry if I've disappointed you.
No, that's great.
So yeah, I think Kierkegaard represents this really interesting thing. And one of the reasons he does that is because he has this, I think, fundamental faith in truth, beauty, goodness, and its ability to kind of string us along. Now, other Kierkegaard scholars might cringe that I just said that, but I actually do think there are good reasons for thinking that's there in Kierkegaard's writing. And I think, I mean, if nothing else, in the fact that Kierkegaard himself was a Christian and seems to have some implicit belief in the power of particularly the love expressed through the triune God. So I think there's something really interesting about Kierkegaard's trying to coax us into having this unsystemizable, anticipatable, the words kind of fail me here, event, or a kind of gift that presents itself to us. Because I think that's really all we can do at the end of the day, is sort of parse out the phenomena as they appear to us, rather than trying to force the world to fit under our particular structures and a priori concepts, and just sort of mashing it through like we would mozzarella through a cheese grater or something.
It seems to me like that part of the irony of the postmodern movement, again, as you see these kind of things kind of trickle down into, like, we've talked a lot on this podcast and elsewhere, like, there's what things mean, and then there's how they're felt meaning, like in people's day-to-day lives, like the connection to the actual meaning crisis. And it's like moving from this place of like divestment of definitions, and is seeking to rid myself of any kind of like ism or a definition or a word that might hold me back. I think it's Jean-Paul Sartre that talks about, like, even if you were to be able to divest yourself of a national identity or a religious identity or whatever, you're still stuck with your own desires, or there's still a cage, which feels like a very like French existentialist thing to think, like, cigarette in your hand, like, who cares? You will never escape, like. And I remember reading Sartre and then kind of reading Paul back and forth and thinking about the conversation that those two would have. But it feels like where it's taken us practically is like we try to divest ourselves of any kind of overly codified definitions, only to find ourselves running to new ones and grabbing for new things. And it's like we never, so now everybody comes with a list of like those isms, like you said, like that. What did you say? It was like epistemological.
Collecting. Yeah.
Epistemological collecting. It's like, I'm this and this and this and this and this and this and this, which seems so contrary to like 20 years ago. It's like, I thought we were trying to like get away from, it's Kierkegaard, right? Like, if you label me, you negate me. And we like,
yeah.
Right.
And also
And now we
Calvin,
just,
right? I think the human heart is an idol factory.
yes, absolutely. And we're
I
seeing
think,
that play out in real time, that we're just, as much as we've tried to divest ourselves of labels, we just quickly reach for others because we can't deal with the existential angst of just being open and bare to the reality.
yeah.
So are you okay? Can you hear us?
You're freezing a little bit, or like kind of choppy for me, Ryan. Landon seems fine.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I got new internet recently and I've been like tinkering with how to best set things up in here, but
Okay.
we may have to go back to a certain large company that shall remain unnamed. It's kind of an anti-sponsorship.
Yeah.
So this probably isn't your job. What do you think comes next? What does the next 100 years look like to you, philosophically speaking?
Yeah.
100 years is a lot.
Not in philosophy.
Everybody's going to read my system, which will fix all the problems of the world. And
let's do it, Doug. Come on, man. We're waiting.
Yeah.
Who needs ChatGPT, man? Just tell us the answers.
I think you raised a lot of really interesting points just now, Ryan. I think, that kind of so I think there's a pragmatic reason we reach for these kind of, what I'll say are intellectual idols, right? And the kind of heuristic or pedagogical devices, because they make it easier to move through the world, right? But the danger is when they become codified into all kinds of sort of untrue, idolatrous experiences like racism or sexism or nationalism, right? Those are kinds of codified idols too. If someone has decided what they believe about a particular group of people and just said they're all like this, so college students, millennials, boomers, right? Whatever, we just put them all on the same shelf because it makes us not have to come into contact with the concepts. So as to what's coming next, obviously it's kind of impossible to predict. And there has been a sense, I think, amongst various different groups, ideologies, whatever you want to call them, a feeling of kind of stagnancy, right? There was a New York Times bestseller by, right, that just called Decadence or something like that. The sense that we've just kind of largely stagnated. I think whatever it is, it will be something we can't quite anticipate. And I think if I could go back to history a bit to look forward again, and I'll be quicker this time. I think in the past, change has largely come as a feature of change in the old meaning structures no longer fitting our current experiences. And then there's this kind of tug of war until finally it breaks and we have to move on to sort of whatever's next. So I think what we're seeing right now largely is everybody's fighting over who gets to say what means what. But we really have no real account of what counts as meaning, right? So people who are, and I use these solely as terms within this context, I'm not using these in any political way, but say those who are conservatively minded want to keep the old meanings, whatever they are, whether they're postmodern or modern meanings or some kind of classical meaning, and those who are liberal minded are maybe want to move totally forward into progress without knowing where that ship is going.
Sorry, progress in the short term is anything that is not that conservative definition.
Yes, and or
basically.
whatever is effective, right? Even if it's just
Right.
our chasing our tails, if we can see some results from it, it counts as something, right?
Mm.
Um, so as to what's next, I think it's largely something that we'll have to tease out of the moment we're in now by, I think, really figuring out, like, who are we as this historical people now? I think the thing that philosophy is undergoing right now is uh, not having any kind of new large overarching systems, and no one's writing those these days, right? We haven't really had one in several hundred years, and we're skeptical about the ability to do those. Philosophy has largely spent the past 50 years or so trying to justify itself as looking something like what the sciences do. So I think the people who are going to be most effective are going to be those who are going to give us some way to think new about what counts as meaning, and then how we might then discover that or uncover that, rather than simply smuggle in things that have worked for others or that counted for a certain group, or so on and so forth. Right.
Mm.
Yeah.
So
It seems like there's this turn, I mentioned earlier, the atomization of society and culture. Some of that, we sort of reference almost in a cliche way to social media, but even pulling that farther back to the Enlightenment and this kind of political shift from monarch to the individual. And I think this is all pulled forward, and technology has kind of exacerbated some of those things. And I think seems to be signs of, we've mentioned the meaning crisis, which we've talked a lot about on the show. There seems to be signs of a response to that, of an attempt to find more integration, or at very least an awareness of, like, hey, maybe like internet connectedness is not serving us, right? And maybe even is completely detrimental to our health holistically, our well-being, um our meaning making, and all these things. Like, what do you see in that space in terms of, like, opportunities for integration or for connection that maybe come from your understanding of philosophical history and just, yeah, any of that? Does anything kind of jump to mind for you?
yeah, I mean, uh,
Only easy questions on today's episode.
yeah, the first thing that jumped to mind when I think of the internet, maybe this is because I spend most of my social media time on Twitter, is the crowd is untruth, as Kierkegaard says. But I think there's, as with all technologies, they're not neutral. They fundamentally change the way we see and approach the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the very invention of the axe changed the way people looked at trees, right? They were no longer merely just trees. They were also now firewood or lumber or, planks in my house or whatever. So I think the internet has fundamentally changed our way of approaching the world, and there's no going back. So, as far as whether or not it counts as real connectivity, I have deep skepticism about that. Largely because of social scientific and psychological and other data that shows the way the more connected we are online, the higher levels there are of anxiety, depression, all these kinds of things. As far as the history of philosophy's connection to that, I mean, there are probably a million different takes you could have about that. what I think is unique about internet connection is precisely just how easy it is to have a voice, and that's both to its credit uh, and to its detriment, because
Yeah.
what you lack there somewhere is something like discernment. If there's anything I've learned from my own studies, it's that expertise doesn't mean you have all knowledge of everything pertaining to your subject matter. Expertise just looks like discernment as regards the things you know well. So like I can look at what other philosophers say, and I can tell when someone is making it up, or similarly with other people when they talk about religion or all these different things. But I have no idea whether or not someone who talks about neuroscience is making it up or not, because I just don't know. I take them on faith, and I think social media adds a whole nother layer to that, because there is no expertise there, and there's no ability to kind of filter. And to its credit, that's given a lot of people voices who never would have had voices in the past. But to its detriment, it's meant that those who don't have discernment are often duped or taken in and herded into echo chambers by their various algorithms. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess as a philosopher, I'm always a little non-committal on this, and I'm just trying to look at a picture from different sides. I don't know what the answer to that is from a philosophical perspective. I mean, I think the truest and best way to deal with that, I think, is to love your neighbor. Is to do the best with what's put before you and the people most immediately in your life. And
yeah, there's this is kind of on the economic side of things, but I think it was Jim Barksdale said the only way to make money is to bundle or unbundle. And this idea that, like, even if we think about like kind of digital technology, right? It was like the album, and then we saw like MP3s happen, then it became the single, and now like singles are starting to move maybe a little bit more back into like it's like everything gets democratized, right? You can listen to everything if we're
right,
talking music, to stick with that, like, but then you crave curation again. And I think we have a similar kind of phenomenon in ideas, even in meaning and in philosophy and information, kind of just like everything is open and accessible in a sense, and I think we're due for some bundling, some curation, and
Yeah.
some, okay, how do
yeah,
we connect with each other in a real way that's like actually meaningful. And I think one thing that's been encouraging, at least, we've talked to John Vervaeke, and I think he represents he's a real figure, I think, in that integration movement of like, he's a person who stands at this really interesting kind of locus of like, he's a cognitive scientist, but he has this really interesting understanding and background in Eastern religions and kind of Western philosophy, and he's able to sort of like pull all of these ropes down, sort of somehow knot them together and be like, hey, we can sort of make all of this stuff work if we're careful about how we, like you said. I think that like hammer tapping um, analogy is really useful. If we can develop some discernment, we have a lot on offer, but we gotta figure out like, how do we make a healthy diet out of the buffet.
yeah,
Yeah.
and yeah, that's really great. I like that language of bundling and unbundling. And I think one of the things I guess I see in religious studies a little bit is um, there's a whole sub movement that I'm really into and kind of fascinated by, which is trying to separate out sort of bigger groups into smaller phenomena. So like there's a lot, there was this movement from religion to religions, and now there's a question of whether or not there's such thing as religions at all. So if you're
of course somebody asked that question.
Yeah.
Why would we just let it be? Why would we do that?
Yeah, Daniel Debasson and a few others have talked about that. But there's really great uses of that, because what you find is religion tends to be a very useful tool to separate who gets to speak in public and who has to keep their views private. So one example being like Hinduism, right? The British largely created that term to say, Hinduism is all the private beliefs that, people in India have to keep to themselves, whereas what we do as Brits is what we can do in public, because that's secular or whatever. But then they like bundled all these things into Hinduism that were just part of Indian national identity. And so there's all kinds of ways in which that's really interesting. So anyway, the bundling made me think, I think that's maybe part of what's coming next too, I think, is this sort of redrawing the lines because of the meaning crisis. The old meanings don't work anymore, and the world is too complicated, and we have to kind of refigure out whether or not we're all even talking about the same phenomena anymore, because the concepts don't work.
Yeah, absolutely. We haven't really done a deep dive too much on Zizek on this podcast, but I've mentioned him a few times, and he talks about ideology, how ideology functions today. And he says, we actually believe more than ever today because we're so ideologically layered with the things that we say. And he gave an example of like, I would say like, if we were to allow it, the relationship between us, like, I love you. Whereas the ancients could just say like, I love you. There is not a necessary qualifiers for you to understand the sentiment that I'm offering, And I think to me, part of the work that needs to come next is to convert the project of bundling and unbundling, if we're going with that language, from one of like resistance and anxiety to the fact that things are constantly changing, into that sense of to be at peace with the fact that it's constantly like, we're never going to quote unquote arrive. Like whatever, there's the generation that builds, the generation that expands, the generation that codifies, the generation that deconstructs. I've kind of heard, my dad taught me that one time about like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, this pattern of like, the entrepreneur, the kind of the marketer, the like the finance person, or the COO, and then the person who divests, that kind of 4-part cycle. And we're constantly going through that cycle. We something starts, it's expanded, it's mitigated or managed, and then it has to be disassembled in order for the thing to start over again, or the arsonists and the perfect building builders. And I think the more that we can learn how to delight in the process itself of exploration, of coming back around to the things that we say that we believe, and never taking them for granted, I think we'll just be, God willing, in a healthier place. Or at least that's what we're trying to do on this podcast anyway.
Yeah, to bring it full circle, right? Augustine emphasizes charity, and charity is an orientation of openness to what's coming next, right?
Yeah, I love that. That feels like a pretty good place to end.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry for talking so much. I know that's kind of part of the gig, but
yeah, you're the expert. We just wanted to sit at your feet and learn from to receive the radiance that comes from above.
I feel like I wish I knew some hand symbol from some kind of iconography or but yeah, thank you guys so much for having me on. It's really been a pleasure. I've had a blast.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah, thanks, Doug.
Cool.
Appreciate it.
All right. We'll talk later.
Cheers.